Okay, we're going to get started there. So last class we had our first test, still in the process of marking, so hopefully I'll get the grades back to you by early next week. So I don't know if you recall, but the class is broken up into 3 chunks. So this is broken up by the 3 different tests. So this concludes like the first section of the course. It might be helpful just to do a quick review just to kind of remember the forest for the trees, what we're trying to do here. So we're trying to understand the person, to try to interpret or make sense of the individual as a person. How do they come to feel and think and act in the world in the ways that they do? How does this manifest within an individual over time? So we kind of are introducing these different modes of investigation. We talked about the limits of the empiricist approach, that you can't touch a subjective thought or experience or feeling or ascertain motives and aims and purposes and things of that sort from just a strict empiricism. So at the very least, we have to introduce various concepts or ideas or metaphors or arguments to make some claim as to how the mind works. So we're introducing a philosophical mode of thinking or a kind of rationalism. If we're doing that, we want it to be the best kind of philosophical investigation that we can manage. So we want to put forth arguments that we're able to identify the assumptions that we're making in the terms that we're using, how we're using the terms, what we're doing with those terms, to put forward arguments that are valid and are likely to be sound. So hence again the conjoining of an empiricist and a rationalist approach in what we're doing. But in addition to that, we want to maybe kind of take seriously the first person subject as the site of experience, and that's where phenomenology comes into play. So phenomenology is a rigorous inquiry into the what it's like of experience. It's not just introspection. It involves some interpretive aims as we're trying to explore some phenomena. It's interested in various existentials. These are existential categories as it relates to what it is to be a person. So we talked about in last class a couple of those existentials. Talked about temporality, that to be a human is to exist and live in time. Also a spatial sense of existential spatiality, that there's a given here over against which you can discern various theirs and objects and even conceive of yourself as an object as we engage in these conceptual abstractions that are afforded to us by culture and so on, right? So, so we're integrating all those approaches. We're working from a model of causality that includes not just the material efficient causality, what there is in terms of materiality and the events that sort of unfolded in some mechanistic way to bring about some entity, but we're also interested in formal and final cause that involve more of the introspective and intersubjectively kind of framed modes of meaning and understanding as it relates to human beings as being embodied within a culture and a society, and part of the mind is arguably extended into this more symbolic way of relating to other human beings. So we talked about behaviorism and again like the limits of behaviorism. So it's interested in stimulus response contingencies as it relates to an organism operating in the environment to bring about some reinforcing stimulus or stimulus that has a punishing effect. It inhibits behavior, something like that. And that's really fine when you're looking at maybe rats and pigeons and that sort of thing. But humans, of course, we have subjective experiences. We have conflicting emotional realities. We have meanings and purposes and intentions and all this other kind of stuff that comes into play. And the behaviorist approach is just not able to make any sense of that. It's just beyond anything that a strict behaviorism is able to do. So then the information processing approach tries to go a little bit beyond that by saying something about what's going on in the organism, but what it's doing effectively, it's borrowing from the computer metaphor to suggest that there's some kind of algorithmic unfolding of events. Again, we're well within the range of efficient causality. That's how a computer works. Remember, at the programming level, we're talking about binary digits, ones and zeros. As it's instantiated in a physical system, we're talking about the switching on and off of transistors. In some metaphorical sense, it's operating according to rules, but not rules, you know, as we might conceive of them as human beings. As I think some students recognize, it's locked into a path. Like, given the input, it just follows this algorithm. It's not even following, right? Because following would suggest that there's an agent of some sort doing the following, right? It's just an eventing that is unfolding to bring about some output or something like that. Now, there are limits in which, like, this is applicable as we're trying to understand, you know, processing kind of demands or limits in terms of how human beings think, and working memory and short-term memory and things of that nature, understanding maybe kind of certain aspects of our neurological functioning as it relates to attentional capacities and things of that nature. But again, the computer is a poor metaphor for understanding the person, because the computer, as we talked about, it doesn't have an embodied sense of itself. It doesn't exist in space. It doesn't have like an awareness of a here over against which it can discern various theirs. It doesn't exist in time in the sense that it has an intuitive notion of the now, the immediacy of the now. It doesn't have a retaining of what was, especially in any way that relates to it as the computer. It isn't able to project itself into time, into various possibilities, and, you know, appropriate those possibilities in some way that it matters to the computer. The computer just doesn't give a damn, right? Whereas these things are very important to us as human beings. Arguably, it, you know, even though it may produce a functional output that seems to mimic what a human does, it doesn't have, you know, what we call qualia. It doesn't have the what it's like of experience that humans have, and it's arguably very important in terms of understanding what it is to be a person. Does that all make sense? Yeah. So again, there are limits where some of this stuff is applicable. We talked about the cognitive behavioral approach to therapy, and what it's doing, it's got one foot in both camps as far as I can tell. It's operating on some kind of inner representational content that involves some kind of matching of patterns or images or ideas or something like that to produce some kind of output, whether that be a thought or a behavior or something like that. But it's modeling it on, as far as I can tell, more of an efficient cause type process. So humans engage in predication. That's, you know, a deliberate sort of act of, you know, playing with meanings and orderings of meanings, affirming, denying various values as it relates to them and their concern and so on. Computers don't do any of that sort of thing, at least the computers that we've been able to produce thus far. So this class is, again, we're kind of building kind of from here. We're appreciating there's some places where the behaviorist, the information processing approach, limited context makes sense. But it's not going to tell us the full story. It's not going to be a full theoretical model to help us understand the human being. In this class, I'm going to try to introduce some ways in which Martin Heidegger's philosophy or insights might apply to our understanding of the person. Heideggerian philosophy has been injected into various kinds of cognitive approaches. So we talked about artificial intelligence, and there's a kind of Heideggerian AI that is being pursued. And so Heidegger is interested in this question of being, right? He's asking the question, and this is important to us as well. We're trying to understand personality. We want to categorize it and interpret it, make sense of it, and understand it, and so on. But it's important, I think, first for us to have some clear sense or even an intuitive feel for, well, what is a person? What is the person's way of being? And Heidegger notes that this question of being has been largely glossed over or ignored in the philosophical tradition. And the question of being, what it means to be, is a very awkward, difficult question to even formulate, let alone answer. But he claims that just because it's difficult to piece together or put forward as a clear proposition doesn't mean that we don't have an intuitive sense of what we're after. And so that relates to this quote here: "Inquiry as a kind of seeking must be guided beforehand by what is sought." we can ask the question, is our way of being as a person, is my way of being the same way of being as that book, or as the table, or as the iPhone, right? Is our way of being similar to that? Is our way of being similar to that of a slug or a lizard, or is there something different about the way that we are in the world? And so this is kind of what he's after. So just a bit of an outline. We're going to talk about, again, the being of a person, Heidegger's concept of Dasein. We'll talk about two different types of intentionality, so this is kind of picking up some of what we touched on here last time. We'll talk about the phenomena of what's called the ready-to-hand versus the present-to-hand. We'll discuss being in the world as a whole, and then we probably won't get to this. We may get to this next time. I'm not sure, the pacing and whatnot, but we may get to like signs and symbols and comparative psychology, speculating about, in what ways humans might be different from other animals. So Heidegger is working from, again, a phenomenological tradition. His teacher was Edmund Husserl, and whose teacher was Franz Brentano, and Brentano was sort of the originators of or explicating phenomenology and intentionality and things of that nature. Remember, phenomenology is after the phenomena, right? Like what it is, how something manifests as it is. There's always a real world concrete example that you can go to draw this thing out. And so, but trying to put some of this into words is a very difficult task. And so reading Heidegger is like, you read 5 or 6 pages and then you digest like maybe 25% of it, but you can't read Heidegger and try to read line by line and figure out what's going on, right? It's like you have to push through and then you circle back and you're able to kind of interpret it at a slightly deeper level, because he's trying to draw forth something or show something that in the tradition we've just glossed over. We don't even have words for, and that's one of the reasons why he's inventing all these words left, right, and center, right? People say, why don't you just speak clearly? Why don't you just speak in everyday language? Well, part of the reason is because everyday language is burdened with all of these, assumptions that he's wanting to challenge. So Heidegger suggests that the kind of being that we are is neither a self-sufficient Cartesian subject, this is the cogito conception, nor a mere occurrent object. Occurrent means like a factual instantiation of some material body or something in Cartesian space. This is again, we have substances over there, and we're going to attach or classify, various properties or attributes to these substances. That's like the scientific mode of theorizing. So the person is neither one of those things. The person is not like this ego or self-sufficient I kind of inner mind stuff. That's not what we are. And we're not just an object or thing out there in the world either. So to understand Heidegger, it's useful to understand what he's railing against. And so one of the main figures that he's railing against is Descartes. And Descartes is a really important figure, not only for philosophy, but for understanding science as well. So René Descartes was a 17th century French philosopher. And what he was trying to do is he's a mathematician, he's trying to build just a philosophical ground, rock solid foundations from which he could then build knowledge. But he wanted to get rid of anything that it was possible to doubt, anything that he could be uncertain about. He wanted to get to some concrete foundation from which he could build. And let me see if I remember this right. So he would, he would go off on his own into his bedchamber, and he would engage in these meditations, and he would consider, like, well, what is possible? What can I sense? What can I doubt? And he would, for example, look at a candle or a flame, and he would question, is this perception real? Is it possible that I could be mistaken about what I'm perceiving? Is it possible that, even my thoughts, that there could be some demon that is inserting these thoughts and playing tricks on me, and so on? And so all of these things, he allowed himself to believe that he could doubt these various things. But the one thing that he couldn't doubt by the end of this process was he put forward this formulation, well, I know that I'm thinking, and my thoughts could be mistaken, but by virtue of the fact that I'm thinking, surely that must demonstrate that I exist. So the formulation is I think, therefore I am, right? And for Heidegger, like, this is the beginning of the separation between the self-sufficient subject as thinker, like the thinking substance, that's the res cogitan. Res means substance, so there's a thinking substance, and then there's the res extensa, extended matter, the extended substance. And so we've separated the knower from what can be known, and now we have the subject-object split. And for Heidegger, this is now like philosophy now has the Humpty Dumpty problem. Now we got to figure out how the mind, the self-sufficient mind with inner representations gets any purchase or contact with the material world, right? And so for Heidegger, this is, many philosophers after him have just taken this up and have agreed with this, and now we're in the business of mistaking, various phenomena and creating pseudo-problems. So now we have the problem of, well, how can I know if I'm trapped in my own mind? How can I know the mind of other people? If I'm stuck in my own head, how do I know that the world out there is real, and all this other kind of stuff? And Heidegger, regarded this as, again, like a pseudo-problem. Now, there's an interesting parallel with some of what Wittgenstein is doing in his later work, because there's, I guess, a consilience of their approaches, and Wittgenstein is again kind of railing against some of this inner representation kind of mind stuff as well. And so his ideas about meaning as use or as language games in social practices and whatever, there's a great deal of parallel with what Heidegger's doing. And these are, again, these are very important philosophers, arguably the two most important philosophers of the 20th century. So there's something, when they're agreeing on something like that, then they're probably onto something. So we're not an immaterial spirit or soul haunting a corporeal body, nor is a person reducible to a third-person account from an extrospective, material efficient framework. So Heidegger puts forth this designation. It's a German term. He invents Dasein. And he says that Dasein is a way of being that belongs to persons. It's our way of being. It's an entity whose very being is an issue for itself. So there's something about the way that we are concerned about how we are, and even why we are, and what should matter, and so on. Now, so there's a way in which, like, so he's saying that the way of being of a person is Dasein. But it's not just picking out like a material human body or something like that. That's not really what he's doing. I think he would say, we can ask, well, do dolphins have Dasein? Do chimpanzees have Dasein? And Heidegger, I think, would be open to that question. Well, it's possible that they do, but it's not something that we can really know. But at the very least, we should get clear on what that means for us. So the etymology of that term, the root of the word combines the German sein from being, from the infinitive to be, and da, which is roughly translated sort of ambiguously as either here or there. So we get the way of being is our being here. And you can think about that as kind of like the site within which experience manifests itself. The clearing through which the world shows itself, in a way. Now, again, you can say, well, look, it sounds like he's talking about consciousness. It sounds like he's talking about the mind, right? Why doesn't he just say that? Well, again, the problem is that terms like mind and consciousness are carrying this philosophical baggage. When you think about mind, you think about inner representations. When you think about consciousness, you're usually talking about self-aware reflective consciousness or something like that. And Heidegger's wanting to break away from these terms. He's trying to show something that has been looked over in the philosophical tradition. So notice that there's this pre-thematized sense of mindness. Pre-thematized means that it's before you put something into some conceptual framework, before you make it into a series of generalizations or abstractions. It's more of an intuitive sense of ownership. We talked about this last time as you know, probably the most basic part of this is by virtue of our being embodied. We have a sense of owning this body, you know, being in control of this body, that it's a vessel or an instrument through which we can, you know, kind of make things happen, rather than something that is just passively, something that passively happens in the way that it would to a computer. Well, even there, a computer is not passive. It's not sitting back and kind of watching things unfold. There's nothing like that going on. But the point is that we claim some authorship over our actions, or that we're concerned about what they might mean. Now, another aspect of Dasein, our way of being, is that Dasein always finds itself thrown into the world. We are inescapably amid the world, both with other entities and objects, and among others, other Dasein, other beings like us. What does it mean to be thrown into the world? Well, it means that you find yourself in various ways, like in ways that you did not choose. You are thrown into a particular culture. You are thrown into a particular social community. You are thrown into, you know, a way of taking up language. You didn't choose this language. You were thrown into an identity. You were given a name that you did not choose, right? And so in a sense, like we find ourselves in this place. We're thrown into a historical period, right? And we are amid the world in a way, like the world as constituted by various tools and artifacts. And I mean, can you imagine what it's, you know, like a child comes into the world and the world is already populated with things like tables and chairs and televisions and phones and iPads and all this kind of stuff that, you know, it just takes for granted. It didn't choose any of this. It doesn't come into the world as like, you know, this thinking ego or something either, where it's like, oh, this is wow, wonderful, all this sort of, this is the world that it knows, you know? More of a tacit knowing, like an implicit knowing. So mere objects, just occurrent things, are not in the world in the way that we're talking about here. So objects cannot encounter other objects, nor as mattering. So if I put a pen on a stack of paper, I can say that, you know, in some sense, that the pen is touching the book, right? Well, we're just talking metaphorically, right? The pen is not reaching out to encounter the book. The book is not able to receive the touch, right? And neither the pen nor the book are able to experience any sense of this connection as mattering, right? They're just objectively present in some Cartesian sense, in Cartesian coordinates. So Dasein alone can be touched, that is, moved by objects and other Dasein. So moved in at least a couple of different ways. Moved in the sense that it is, you know, emotionally moved in some way. We are moved in terms of how it, you know, causes various moods and dispositions to show up that reveal the world in various ways, right? Things matter to us viscerally. So there's a moved in that sense, but there's also a moved in the sense that it it has significance, it has some bearing, it relates to us as individuals in our concern for ourselves and for the people that are part of our lives. We do not encounter the world as a nexus of things, just stuff, just an endless array of like matter. That's not the way that we encounter the world primarily. We inhabit or dwell within the world. It becomes part of us, how we relate to other objects and people. When we talk about dwelling, we're not talking about like a cognitive kind of ruminating, right? I'm getting fixated, I'm dwelling on some issue or something like that. We're talking about dwelling in the sense of inhabiting. It means being absorbed within a community or a socio-cultural kind of nexus of intelligibility. It means being immersed in that way. We dwell in our language, in our social practices, and our skills. When we use language, we're attending from our body, from our articulations, to the point that we're trying to make, to the meaning that we're trying to communicate. And language just seems to follow along. It just happens in a way, right? It's not like there's always this thinking subject that is considering every single word and how it flows together, right? That's not what's going on. So what he's doing, so Descartes, again, like what he did was he cleaved or made this separation between the thinker, the subject, and the world. So Heidegger would always put world in that sense with scare quotes, right? Because again, it's the noumenal world, it's the world that we can't ever fully ascertain, right? And so he's trying to show that on the most fundamental level, we can take up the Cartesian attitude, right? And that's what scientists do, right? But we don't typically live that way. The way that we live is just through these embodied enactments and involvements, right? That's what he's trying to say. So, we talked about all the different ways that, some of the different ways that we just have this tacit understanding of what we do within these social situations, right? And we don't have to think about it. There's not, I guess another way of putting that is that there's not this inner representation. That's part of what the paper was trying to show, is that the traditional cognitivist approach involving, manipulations of representations in the head or something like that, we can do that, but much of the time that's not like the ground floor of the way that we are in the world. So dwelling is Dasein's basic way of being in the world, grounded in a pre-thematized familiarity. So when he puts the hyphenations in some entity, like being in the world, well, why does he do that? Well, he's doing that to show that being in the world is a holistic phenomena. But the hyphenations also suggest a kind of engagement or activity, right? It's not a passive eventing or something like that. We're engaged in pursuing various tasks and fulfilling various ends as they relate to us and as they're intelligible within a conceptual community. Another way of coming at some of this stuff is, this is a phrase that is popularized within the existential tradition: existence precedes essence. It means that there's a sense of being, just like the that it is of existence, raw experience, if you will, comes before any kind of accounting for, fundamental essences, in some categorical, classifying kind of way. Another way of putting it is, being before knowing, or ontology, a fundamental ontology before epistemology. So before you get into this whole business of how you know what you know and what justifies what, you have to have a sense of that there is something. What that something is can be a bit ambiguous, but that it is of experience is undeniable, and that arguably comes first. So only beings like us exist in Heidegger's sense. So existence is used in a technical meaning here. So what he's not talking about is just like, he's not denying, like in a certain sense, that the everyday way of speaking, well, tables and chairs exist. He would just prefer to call it something different. So he's saying existence is the way of being of a human, or it applies to a human, whereas tables and chairs are just objectively present. So Dasein always understands itself in terms of its existence, in terms of a possibility of itself, to be itself or not itself. So there's a recognition of some unsettledness in the way that we are in the world, that it's not all determined, that there's some free play, and we experience that freedom, and there's often some anxiety with that, but there's a possibility of choosing ourselves, and we can do that, as we'll see later, we can do that authentically or inauthentically, right? But again, we don't want to deny that there are, a multitude of constraints. There are biological constraints at the material efficient level, right? I can't sprout wings and fly. I can't go diving underwater for hours at a time without scuba gear, right? There are biological constraints. And then there are social constraints in terms of, the particular culture that you're thrown into, what is intelligible within that space, what it makes sense to do. And in many ways, we take up these cultural practices without really considering what they're about or why we're doing it. But we can, sort of within those different constraints, there is a kind of freedom there that we, in a way, we choose in part who we will become, who we are. To exist is to take a stand on what is essential about one's being and to be defined by that stand. So contrast this with, like, we can talk about identity. We can talk about identity as it's accounted for from an extrospective frame. So who you are is, whatever your race is. Who you are is whatever your gender is. Who you are is, if I follow you around long enough as a scientist, I can infer what your sexual orientation is, and that's your identity. Well, I didn't choose any of that stuff, right? And because I didn't choose it, does it make sense for me to be proud of any of that or to feel shameful of any of that? We're not talking about any of that here when we're talking about, we're talking about, like, how you define yourself in terms of your values, the unsettledness, this openness that is yours. Again, it's this mindness or this ownership over your possibilities. And Heidegger says at one point, Dasein is its possibilities, right? Like there's an openness that has to be settled in some way, and we as individuals are the only ones that are capable of settling that, determining the kind of being that we will be. So we can talk about or differentiate two different kinds of intentionality, and this should make a little bit more sense. We talked about one kind of intentionality. We'll kind of reinforce that again here today. But there's a form of intentionality that, if you've taken some philosophy courses, this is the form of intentionality that you're probably most familiar with. And it's a kind of representational intentionality. So the idea is that we subjectively perceive or represent our perspectives. We represent them in our thoughts, in our beliefs, in mental images, patternings, and then we synthesize these different perspectives into thematized objects or concepts, and then we assign a function based on the physical properties and this sort of thing. So there's this inner representation, there's this inner mind stuff that's sort of, manipulating symbols and things like that. And so when we talk about aboutness, intentionality as being, directing itself toward, it's primarily directing itself towards inner representations. And from Heidegger's perspective, this erroneously subjectivizes intentionality. It assumes that there's always an ever-present ego or a self-aware subject set apart from a world of objects. And so again, we have the separation of mind and world, and Heidegger is wanting to say that, no, this is, much of the time a holistic phenomena. So this representational intentionality is in contrast to the kind of intentionality that we kind of touched on here last time, but we can call it absorbed intentionality, or just more basically what we do when we're comporting ourselves toward various acts and goals and so on. So absorbed intentionality is, or what's called fluid comportment, describes the way Dasein relates to things and people. So our everyday way of just moving about in the world, everyday way of interacting with people, that we do this without, kind of reflective consideration. There's not always this monitoring of what we're doing and why we're doing it, right? We just engage in ways that are familiar to us based on our experiences. When my oldest daughter was young, she wasn't even a toddler, she wasn't speaking or anything like that. My wife would have her, like when I'm kind of leaving in the morning, I would have my hand on the door and I'd open the door to go down into the basement and hop in the car. And my daughter would kind of wave like this, right? And we can ask, so when she does that, at that age, right, so she's not even 2 years old, are we wanting to say that my daughter has this sense of what the wave signifies, what it means, that she's intending to wish me a happy day, in our time apart or something like that? Is there an intuition of, I'm going to miss you? Like, is there all this sort of mind stuff happening, with a child of that age? Or is it just, this is kind of what we do, and I don't know why we do it, but it seems to happen. It's almost like there's like something happening in the situation, my hand on the door, for example, or pulling the door open, that solicits that response, right? It doesn't mean that there's a thinking, I mean, there's obviously thought stuff, but not like this inner representation in this, kind of conceptual way. And then it's interesting that, at that time, so she'd do the wave sort of thing, and then when I would just go down into the basement to get something out of the freezer, she would also do this sort of wave. So she's overgeneralizing in that way. So our comportments refer to our directed activity, our directing oneself toward or being directed toward. There was something else in here that so in the paper that I had you guys read, they talk of affordances, right? So that in the environment, presents a situation that affords various responses or solicits various responses that have a kind of familiarity, right? So examples being a pause in a conversation affords talking. A friend's sad face invites comforting, and a lifted hand of another affords a high five, right? Arguably, this stuff, it just happens almost reflexively, or just there's an implicit understanding of what is appropriate to do in a given situation, right? A sneeze, affords someone saying, gesundheit or something like that, right? And so these things are kind of operating in the background. These are background practices that we dwell within. And in therapy, therapy tries to help people, or at least, certain kinds of therapy, the kind of therapy I do, it tries to help people notice or open up a space where they can experience something that they might have glossed over, or see something in their behavior, in their way of being, that they hadn't been able to, kind of be aware of in some conceptual sense. When you're doing relationship work, this is particularly apparent, right? So what are you doing when you're doing couples counseling or relationship work? Well, you're trying to help them improve on how they communicate with one another. But first you're watching to see just what happens all on its own. So there's a familiarity of what it's like to be with this person. And well, why can't these people sort this stuff out on their own? Well, because you're immersed within, you're absorbed within that dynamic. You're attending to words, perhaps, and meanings and this other kind of stuff, and you're maybe not attending to what's happening on more of an implicit level, certainly on an emotional level. And so that's kind of what a therapist does. And so when a person is able to express some vulnerable feeling, right? Well, in a sense, that affords the response of comforting, right? But what happens sometimes is that does not happen, right? Sometimes what will happen is that someone takes a risk in sharing something, and then their partner will kind of nudge their knee and kind of make a joke or something like that. And then they'll keep kind of going on. They'll kind of keep conversing or something. Now, if you draw their attention to, well, what just happened here? Do you notice what you just did, or how you responded to, your partner and what they just expressed to you? And for many people, that's like, no, I didn't notice that. And wow, that's kind of concerning, or that's, interesting, or that's, what does that say about me, or how we get caught up in these patterns? Silences are interesting in therapy too. So therapists will make good use of silences, right? We do that intentionally. Well, why do we do that? To create a space where something can happen, where a feeling can emerge even, right? Well, what happens if we just get caught up in just talking, right? Some people do that, right? They kind of talk over their feelings, or they talk over what might be happening interpersonally. They just kind of go. Well, they don't open up that space where something else, might show up. So again, all these basic ways of being, existing, it's preconceptual. It's just a basic familiarity in how we are in the world and how we relate to people. So again, there's no mentalistic connotations here. There's no inner thought stuff going on in what we're talking about as it relates to absorbed intentionality. So intentionality is attributed not to consciousness conceived as like an inner thinker or something like that, but to Dasein, just to our way of being. Not all human activity is deliberate, like explicitly thought out, and therefore not all activity is caused by a self-referential mental state. I mean, just even think about, I guess, you're just even arriving here to class, right? Like some people took the bus and you probably walked out your door and you kind of did all the things with locking doors and walking downstairs and walking to a bus stop, and you probably did a good chunk of that without analyzing every single moment of what's happening and deliberately planning out. You just do this because it's so familiar, it's part of your routine. You have this intuitive understanding of what's what. You don't stare, disinterestedly at, the bus as it arrives and trying to analyze, what is this thing? What is it all about? What does it do? Like, you just hop on the bus, and you're doing that while thinking about probably how much homework do I have, or what do I need to get done today, or, how am I going to deal with this issue with my boss at work, or something like that, right? You're absorbed in those involvements, and you're just doing what needs to be done. So the sense of oneself as an actor or a subject effectively disappears. We become absorbed within the referential totality of involvements and into the familiar background practices related to our circumspective concern. So just, again, getting to school on time, we just go through all those, the actions that, bring us to that point. Could be fixing a leaky faucet that we fixed a number of times before. We pick up the wrench and the tape and so on. We're not staring at this wrench as this weird, odd thing that we've never seen before. We just use it, right, for the service, in the service of fixing it. Apologizing to a friend. Again, there are social situations that create a space that, solicits that response, the apology, the I'm sorry. But we also know the difference between, saying it because that's what one says in the situation and saying it authentically, right? We know the difference, I think. So we'll talk about, some different attitudes that we might take up toward various entities in the world. Heidegger claims that there are three different kinds of beings or attitudes that we can take toward beings. There is Dasein, the entity that has the capacity of being here. There's what he calls the present at hand, and then the ready to hand. So ready to hand is effectively know-how. It's the attitude we take toward equipment and tools, as well as signs, being able to use signs or interpret signs intuitively without any kind of conceptual, thinking, and even language, when in the mode of this sort of business of absorbed coping or dealing within the ongoing flow of just engaged activity. Present at hand is knowing that. It's the explicit pulling apart and looking at something disinterestedly as an object or as a thing. It's the detached spectator or scientific attitude taken toward entities that are viewed as categorical objects or things with various properties. So we can take up both attitudes, right? That's certainly possible. But what he's trying to show especially is that there's a quality of the ready to hand that we often gloss over or ignore in our understanding of our way of being. So in everyday experience, we rarely find ourselves taking a detached Cartesian perspective or theoretical attitude, experiencing ourselves as self-sufficient subjects over and against an external world populated by just objects or substances with various attributes or generalizable qualities. We can use science, in our practices in ways that work for us and, fulfill various purposes, but we can't exist scientifically, right? You live in the first person and you live in accordance with, that referential whole within which you dwell. So again, we find ourselves always already situated within a world. We're always in the business of, on some low level, just interpreting our experience, not in some heady conceptual inner representational kind of way, but just by virtue of our being absorbed within these practices. We encounter entities through their availability, projecting their possibilities of use within a totality of involvements for the sake of some ongoing activity, for some purpose or end that we're trying to fulfill. So Heidegger calls this way of relating to entities ready to hand. And so essentially what it means that you take it up and use it. There's not a detached, kind of understanding of this thing. We talk about the hammer example. Well, to understand a hammer is not to look at it as some, kind of metal blob, attached to a wooden shank. That arguably is to fail to understand a hammer, right? It's a deficient mode of understanding in a way. To truly understand a hammer is to have an intuitive sense in how it links up within that referential whole, both to nails and building materials and so on, but it's also to take it up and use it. It's to be able to use it in the right way, in the right context. Again, that's a knowing how. And so you don't see the hammer as a thing, as an object, unless there's some kind of breakdown, unless there's a malfunction, there's something wrong with the hammer. The same thing with, it's amazing, children when they're learning how to use iPads and stuff like that, they're just like wizards with all this, kind of swiping and this and that and so on. And someone who, was really late coming to the whole iPhone, iPad phenomenon. I was a BlackBerry guy for the longest time, just held on to the last moment. And then how am I coming at it? Well, I'm coming at it in this detached, theoretical, like, well, what is this? What does it do? Why am I swiping? What is this for? Whereas my daughter, it's just like, well, this is just what you do, right? It's just an intuitive, she just picks it up in that way. So when we open a door, we rarely register the door as a door, right? As something made of wood with particular dimensions, a circular knob, brass polish, all this other kind of stuff. We simply open or close it in order to exit or enter a room, in order to improve airflow, to gain privacy, reduce noise, You know, these sorts of things. It's tied up in what we're up to, what we're trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish, our purposes, and so on. So the same thing again for climbing a set of stairs, opening a window, sitting in a chair, all this other kind of stuff, right? Like you don't walk into the room like, you know, thinking like in amazement, my God, you know, this object, this thing, this chair, what does it do again? Oh yes, it's you know, for the sake of sitting on. And like you don't do that. You just come into the room, you got a bunch of stuff on your mind, you just sit down. That's just what happens, right? Unless, you know, your chair falls apart, the leg comes flying off, and then you're wondering what the hell's going on here, and you're trying to take a scientific attitude to figure this thing out and what happened. So tools or equipment are entities encountered in our everyday concern and cannot be properly discovered by just staring at them. Our understanding is pre-theoretical. You don't fully understand a screwdriver or an iPhone by just observing it detachedly. You grasp its meaning, again, by using it. There's a practical or involved bodily know-how versus a disengaged knowing that, relevant to purposeful activity. So we ordinarily manipulate tools and equipment that already have some meaning in the sense that it's bound up in a referential totality. You know, it's the basis of intelligibility within our culture, within a particular context, within this world that's organized in terms of purposes, what it makes sense to do in a given context. Equipment has an in order to structure, assignment or reference of something to something in order to achieve some end. So we produce shoes for wearing. We have clocks for telling time. We have signs for indicating various things, and depending on the context. The ready to hand is encountered within the world that humans inhabit. You can think about the other animal kind of thing just briefly, right? Like, do other animals understand, you know, in the way that we understand, you know, the nature of, you know, clocks and tables and chairs and iPads and things like that? Well, and robots, you know, like, well, not really, because they're not in that world. They're not in, you know, the meaningful practices in the way that we are. We encounter the ready to hand as holistic. So, for example, we experience the coffee shop and not a collection of individual items, you know? So you walk into the coffee shop, and it's not like you're just in amazement. Okay, look at those glasses, and look at that shelf, and look at, like I then infer that because of this and this and this and this and this, that I am actually in a coffee shop. That's not how it goes. There's you know, just a familiar understanding of these different things that seem to go together, and you see the coffee shop as a whole. Now again, unless there's some kind of breakdown of some sort, unless there's some kind of weird, bizarre, obtrusive kind of thing, like if you walked into the coffee shop and, you know, you saw like a big pile of potatoes or something like that, you would wonder, like, okay, what's going on here? What is this about? Is this a coffee shop? Did I walk into like a produce, you know, kind of outlet or something? So the ready to hand belongs to a referential or equipmental totality. So that there's hammers and nails and building materials, all these things kind of go together within a context. That partially constitutes the world inhabited by people. Now what's interesting is that different people can inhabit, in some ways, different worlds, right? Depending on their involvements and, you know, purposes and meanings that kind of bear on their lives and so on. And it allows things to show up differently for those people, right? So I have a friend who he sells like lighting and things like that. Well, when he walks into a room like this, he doesn't see like the classroom in the way that we see it. You guys walk in, you're looking for a place to sit. He walks in and he says like, oh, how horrible that light is, right? An electrician walks in here and is able to notice very quickly where all the plugs are and that sort of thing. We wouldn't notice that or even consider it unless we had a laptop that we were trying to plug in or something like that, right? Equipment has a place, and we have this tacit expectation of what we find in that place, or I think what Heidegger calls like a region, right? And it can lead to all kinds of kind of weird, funny things. Like, just a funny example is, I think it was last year sometime, there was a morning that I was in a huge rush just to get to work. I woke up late and trying to get out the door and this sort of thing. And I rushed into the washroom. I was going to grab a quick shower, and there's no towels, right? And so I rush out into the hallway, and I'm looking in the dryer, and there's nothing there. I just assumed that they just didn't get taken out of the dryer. And then I rush to the linen closet, and I'm looking for the towels, and there's no towels there. And so I call to my wife, and I say, you know, where are the towels? Where are the towels? And she says, they're right up there. You just look for them. And I walk into the bathroom, then I walk out, and I yell again, where are the towels? Just look, they're right there. And so I walk back into the bathroom, and where are the towels? The towels are neatly folded on the floor in front of the bathroom, right? Now, what's hilarious about this example is that I stepped over the towels, you know, at least 2 times, and it did not register that the towels were there. What is that? Am I just an idiot? Well, possibly, but I think you know, the better way of interpreting that is that towels have their place. They have their place on the hook. They have their place in the dryer. They have their place in the linen closet. Towels are not to be on the floor. So it almost didn't even register as, you know, and yet there was some level in which my body was able to perceive it enough that I could step over it, right? But it didn't register in my meaningful concern. So again, there are no ontological presuppositions when we're talking about world. So we're not talking about world as a, you know, a set of things out there. We're talking about world more in terms of our involvements and our being embedded within a world, dwelling within a world. Now this is kind of links up with tacit knowledge or embodied knowledge in a way. It seems to have like a from-to structure. So the ready to hand is similar to tacit knowledge or bodily know-how. In this way, we attend from the engaged body, for example, holding the pen, to the meanings of the words on the page or the message we intend to convey. So when you're writing, you're not aware of the pen. The pen is just a part of your, it might as well be a part of your body, right? You're just attending to the words that you're trying to put on the page or the meanings. The pen is in the background. The pen withdraws in a way, unless there's a problem with the pen, unless you kind of look, your pen is not, you know, properly working, there's no ink coming out or something. Now you're looking at it as a scientist might, you know, what's going on with this thing. The same thing with language again, we're dwelling within our language as we're trying to communicate for various purposes or to express some meaning or point or something like that. And the words just naturally come out. If we, you know, similar to the playing guitar example, if we attend to the fingers, if we attend to every single word, the whole thing starts to break down a little bit. The words have to be in the background as we're attending from our bodies and the articulation to whatever it is that we're trying to express or communicate. So in some ways, what is attended to solicits or calls forth the appropriate action or response. Another sort of example that illustrates some of this, and the difference between like an existential body, like being embodied, having a body, and how we might comport our attention or, you know, where our concern lies as we find ourselves embodied versus like a Cartesian body. Good example is you know, sports or you know, whether you're running or whether you're kind of working out or something like that. Now, for the longest time, one of the things that I tried doing is I tried listening to podcasts as I'm working out, because, you know, trying to just, you know, multitask as much as you can and sort of like, well, I'm learning while my body's kind of doing what it needs to do. But I think anyone who's actually tried that, it kind of works for running, because running is sort of this monotonous, kind of mechanical kind of thing, and so you can lose yourself in running as you're actually learning things. But if you're actually trying to, move your body to do something forceful, it becomes very difficult. You kind of lose that sort of drive or that energy. So, and I think some people know this, like you can get your mind, focused on something totally different from what's happening here in a way to call forth an appropriate response that wouldn't come up otherwise. And so one of the things is that, anyone who does any kind of like lifting heavy weights or powerlifting, that kind of stuff, you envision some situation that would call forth like a Herculean effort on your part. So, when you're at the end of your set or something like that, you're doing deadlifts and you're trying to lift this heavy weight off the ground. Like for me, I envision, one of my daughters like trapped under some piece of timber that has, the house is burnt down. I'm trying to lift this thing, and you can make it happen. Now, where am I when that's happening? Well, my body is in, the gym. It's there in this space in some, Cartesian sense, but my concern is elsewhere. My concern is, working with this, mental imagery in such a way that it can call forth this energy to make my body do what it needs to do. And lots of people do that, right? That's a very common thing. At the end of a run or something like that, you're trying to envision like someone in danger or trouble, and you're trying to, get all that, whatever you need to do, every last drop out of the gas tank to finish your run in a reasonable time. So again, this is a very important part of what it is to be a person. And we do this, we make use of this in therapy. We try to, to reveal that the way in which a person is, and we try to disclose that and allow the person to kind of see it in a way that they can then make use of.
Say like the scientific.
Oh, yeah, that's very important. Like, so he's not taking issue with the scientific approach at all, right? He's saying that that's perfectly fine and reasonable as it applies to our attempts to understand like non-Dasein entities, right?
Okay, what would he say when also?
He would, because you're not looking at yourself as an object. I mean, well, this is interesting. So a physician will often look at you as an object, as just a thing or a process or something like that. And physicians that have very poor bedside manner, that's all that they see you as, right? So they don't see you as simultaneously an embodied human being that has feelings and thoughts and things like that, right? So, okay, we'll wrap up there, and we'll see you guys back next week.